As the influence of Eastern ideas grew greater through the 20th century, ethical, metaphysical and mystical concepts and terminology found their place in the wider ideational vocabulary of scholarly and popular knowledge. For instance, the speculative concepts of a cyclical cosmology, reincarnation, karma, planes of existence, a multiplicity of cosmic causative forces and so on were treated as legitimate subjects of serious critique and analysis, as well as simplified and watered down for public consumption. And in the everyday world, an even greater influence was incorporated as a practical component of daily life for many. The dialogues and exposition of ideas conducted by Eastern scholars like Suzuki, Coomaraswamy, Radhakrishnan, Yutang and many others helped express the conceptual foundations from a more familiar and intrinsic perspective, though using the apparatus of Western terminology to illustrate meaning. And Western scholars and thinkers devoted themselves to thorough analysis and exposition of Eastern texts, ideas, cultural traditions. Evans, Wentz and Gunther, for instance, focused on Tibetan belief and thought. Whaley, Creel, Wilhelm, Needham examined Chinese history, culture and ideas. Kahns, St. Cherbatsky, Humphreys, Warren focused on scholarly exposition of Buddhist thought. Deussen, Gwenin, Avalon, Zimmer examined the complexities of Hinduism. And these are just a small proportion, mostly from the first half of the 20th century, of those who have contributed to a more thorough and detailed understanding of Eastern ideas. The second half of the 20th century saw exponentially greater expansion of scholarly and philosophical treatment of all facets of Eastern thought. Returning to consideration of the pervasion of Eastern thought within the wider Western milieu, we see that perhaps the most impact was in the sphere of prosaic daily activity. The practice of the body and mind disciplines of yoga and meditation rapidly infiltrated the Western ideational framework. And though roughly parallel or similarly directed techniques had also been known and practiced for centuries within Western traditions, it was the Eastern stimulus which supplied the impetus to a renewed and revalued approach. The mental and physical disciplines of many Western religious systems of prayer had the same basic intentions, the attainment of a profound spiritual experience. However, because the Eastern methods were imported and free of the connotations and connections with the prevailing Western religious institutions, their appeal towards a more secularly inclined and younger, less rigidly doctrinaire populace was more direct. The attendant Eastern conceptual framework could be adopted as wholly as possible by those aiming for the purest immersion into a different mode of envisioning reality. Often Eastern spiritual gurus would attract followers who desired this full-time, life-transforming approach. Communes, schools, cults, groups would emerge with the common bond of perpetuating and facilitating their type of idealized envisioned environment. Of course, the degree of immersion varied, from those more of a temporary, periodic or partial retreat to those entirely devoting and configuring their lives to a totally re-envisioned orientation. Or else, focus could be directed entirely to the technical and practical approach, in which discipline of body and mind were less encumbered by the adjunct framework of cultural qualifications. Attention to techniques and disciplines of the mind-body dynamic as represented in Eastern thought covers a wide range of interests. These range from the primarily physical, where the goals are longevity, health, vitality, and so forth, to the extreme spiritual, where personal transcendence, bliss, enlightenment are desired. And in between are a very wide mix of concerns, where both enhanced physical and mental capacities are perceived attainable through a variety of disciplines and practices involving both mental and physical sides. And somewhere in this spectrum of intentional practices is also the belief that between the physical and the spiritual lies a domain equivalent to what has been termed the psychic, or occult. We will discuss this category in more detail soon, but it should be noted that in many areas of Eastern thought and discipline the existence of so-called psychic powers, is taken as an accepted and proven premise, and that progressive development and control of these powers is a legitimate aim of particular disciplines. In many cases, not as the ultimate and final end, but nonetheless, still a milestone on the road to further progress. For instance, in the tantric Buddhistic practices found in Tibetan tradition, in some of the practices of later Taoism, in some forms of Hatha Yoga, in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. In most contexts, the higher and purer aims of spiritual realization are the main objective, while on the more immediate level, physical well-being is the prime consideration. And all varieties of practices, techniques, surrounding philosophies, behavioral systems, and so on have been promulgated in a number of ways. By scholarship, textual study, extraction of particular methodologies and so on. However, perhaps the most impactful spread of these systems and schools has been through a combination of exposure to ideas and to charismatic expounders of those ideas and practices. There have been a steady stream of Eastern gurus, who have brought their vision to the West over the years, starting most notably in the late 19th century and continuing ever since. Their specific orientation, message, prioritization of ideas, ideals, suggested guidelines for behavior have varied. Some, like Paramhansa Yogananda, have presented a primarily devotion-centered system, as have the followers of Swami A.C. Bhaktivedanta and the Hare Krishna movement with their Bhakti Yoga-derived system. Swami Vivekananda stressed practice of Vedanta-based yoga and meditation. Sri Aurobindo unfolded a complex and detailed philosophical system, expressed in both Eastern and Western terminology, and a communal base dedicated to living according to the ideals of his vision. In the 1960s, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi attained tremendous notoriety and attention through attraction of famous celebrities to his system of transcendental meditation. Bhagavan Rajneesh likewise was in the public spotlight in the 1980s as he and his communes gained notoriety for lavish expenditures, acquisition and display of wealth within the parameters of his system of belief and conduct. The varied types of positions and mixed confluence of ideas and beliefs obviously differed from proponent to proponent, from guru, teacher, exponent of a specific orientation. Some clearly tried to remain faithful to traditional cultural and historical models. Others were attempts at westernizing sets of Eastern ideas and precepts. And any number of idiosyncratic hybrids also appeared. And the role of the personal guru should also not be underestimated. Following the traditional Eastern valuation of the individual, wise man, many transplanted schools, sects, communities were legitimized by belief in the authenticity and authority of the messenger as well as the message. Charisma, demeanor, personality, presentation all factored into the appeal of the idea, belief, behavior package. And has been shown over time, individuals belonged at differ end bands on the spectrum between exemplary and cynically deceitful. Certainly it can be presumed that at least the majority of Eastern proselytizers acted fully within the bounds of good faith and intrinsic personal commitment to and belief in that specific set of ideals and ideas. Yet as can be expected simply by the probabilities inherent in such attempts at radical cultural grafting, a certain percentage of charismatically imbued individuals would tend to compromise and distort a given system of ideas and beliefs for ulterior motives. But the relative purity of particular schools and systems is not our main focus. Once more we must refer back to the important influence of Eastern ideas as a general impetus towards a broadening of the Western mode of envisioning reality. The serious study, dissemination, understanding, synthesis of Eastern thought and vision went on simultaneously with the popularization of particular concepts and activities, and the sometimes sensationalized examples of social and personal behavior within specific organizations. As well, the possibility of separating practical application of body and mind discipline from the connection to a strict orthodox doctrinal conformity allowed a broader popularization of the inner-directed, subjectively enacted practices. Thus elements of the wider Eastern spiritual traditions were incorporated more easily into a secular orientation where they could serve functionally as a means to the end of qualitatively enhanced personal spiritual experience. And as well, the possibility of incorporating the general elements of technique within a generically broader spiritual frame of reference allowed a more seamless connection to existing traditional meditative systems. Whether simply by focusing on parallels and amplifying the common elements, discarding contradictory features, or by attempts at synthesizing dual traditions into a more comprehensive whole. In any event, the influence of Eastern ideas extended through a wide variety of Western cultural forms. Music, art, fashion, political, social and personal conduct and speculation in the West were all at some point in the 20th century open to Eastern influence. Even if just as a transitory trend or minor excursion, the effect overall has led to a further infusion of supplementary data within the envisioning Western framework. Another emerging ideational thread most embedded in the unique circumstances of the 20th century arose out a somewhat ambivalent attitude towards technology. On one hand, there was a sense of cynicism, distrust, suspicion towards technology as manifest seemingly indiscriminately and amorally in terms of objectives and ends. On the other, there was a fascination with new ideas, inventions, fields of exploration, and idealist hope that the powers, energies, forces underlying technology could be harnessed and used to stimulate a new progressive phase of social life. The products and their uses, the techniques of manipulation, operation, organization, and the ideologies formed to support and justify particular endeavors and applications could be benign and revolutionary or dehumanizing and catastrophically destructive. Over the century there was increasingly more public questioning of the justification of the manipulation and exploitation of nature, which had proceeded relatively unchecked and sanctified throughout modern history. Especially critical and pertinent in light of the unprecedented devastation of wars fought with the use of the tools of the new technology. As more extensive knowledge of the facts and understanding of the effects occurred, their dissemination through the second half of the 20th century helped define a counterposition, based on a positive valuation of more organic and holistic attitudes. In fact, the distrust of indiscriminate use and abuse of technology and fear of impersonal technocratic implication and adaptation really resulted in dual negative reactive attitudes in the envisioning of reality. On the microcosmic plane, the keyword was that of alienation, and pertained mostly to reflection upon the status of the individual within this new apparently threatening or depersonalized modern world. And one of the defining concepts on the macrocosmic scale was that of ecology, which focused on the relationships of species within the physical environment, and all the encompassing systemic dynamics pertaining to the sustenance of life. The recognition of a distinctive attitude in Western civilization of man to the world is evident in the ideational structures of religion, philosophy and science. It is a characteristic of the dominant cultural mainstream. Spengler perhaps has a useful characterization in these words describing the modern Western, or Faustian, attitude in comparison to that of other cultures. Very different is the Faustian technics, which thrusts itself upon nature, with the firm resolve to be its master. Here, and only here, is the connection of insight and utilization a matter of course. The Western strives to direct the world according to his will. The Faustian inventor and discoverer is a unique type. The primitive force of his will, the brilliance of his visions, the steely energy of his practical ponderings. And so they created the idea of the machine as a small cosmos obeying the will of man alone. This distinctive Western historical approach was legitimized tacitly or more explicitly in various ways within the dominant ideational systems, although at times specific critiques and alternative approaches were presented. This has been especially evident in the 20th century in response to the issues arising from the economic and political application of technology. And the role of science has also suggested ethical concerns and provoked new lines of argumentation. Particularly, bringing up concerns about the moral obligations and responsibilities of those empowered to use the tools of science. One of the traits of the valuation of an ecological awareness and sensitivity was a belief that the premises and practices of science required a quotient of moral commitment and concern. That there was a degree of pretense, contrivance, naivety or self-delusion underlying the scientific claim of pure objectivity. As we have said, one of the dynamics of science in the 20th century has been a recognition that there is a personal dimension to the methodological procedure of acquiring and articulating knowledge. And, from the ecologically sensitive perspective, indiscriminate application of theoretical knowledge through the tools and techniques of technology is a betrayal of a fundamental moral bond between man and nature. The traditional Western scientific application of knowledge to conquer and tame nature itself was felt to be a flawed premise. Although Western civilization itself reaped the benefit of many life-improving advances and innovations, the potential for, and manifestations of, technologically grounded evils and catastrophes meant that more was at stake than obediently fulfilling predetermined economic or political objectives, or pursuing particular lines of experimentation and investigation without consideration of the wider implications of such endeavors. The discussion of moral issues and concerns raised questions about conscience, obligation, responsibility, trust, and the entire spectrum of factors relating to the role of technology in society. Theodore Roszak has this view of how the use of scientific knowledge has deviated from the ideals proposed by Francis Bacon as science was emerging as a major institution of legitimation. To be sure, it was Bacon's prayer that the new philosophies should be applied, but for the benefit and use of life. He could scarcely have foreseen the assault upon humanity and the rape of the environment that would follow from an unrestricted application of the objective mode of consciousness to the whole of human experience. And yet there are moments when even Bacon betrays a shocking, though inadvertent awareness of where the promised power of his method lies. Consider his weakness for the political realism of Machiavelli. Did he not recognize in this political context the cynical truth that power flows from a simple willingness to break faith, to harden the heart and abandon the fellowship of feelings? To accuse science of breaking faith between human beings and their environment may seem a harsh indictment. And yet, can any less dramatic and demonic conception of the scientific revolution do justice to the stupendous dynamism which has characterized Western civilization over the last 3 centuries? Like no society before it, the modern West has played the conquering hero in its dealings with nature, attacking it with the sort of ferocity and wantonness that one only vents upon a foe little trusted and less to be pitied. But once we elevate such a psychic mode to the highest cultural dignity, identifying it as the only intellectually productive way of addressing the universe, all the profits of the Baconian investment are bound to be forthcoming in abundance. There will indeed be knowledge, power, dominion without limit. We are licensed to unravel all mysteries and to remake the world, including human nature itself. We need respect no obligations to nature, to beast or plant, mountain or forest, river or wilderness, because we may disregard the living address of the environment. Nature itself can claim no natural rights. It is simply the arena in which man plays out a Promethean role. We see significantly that there is a presumed mindset, an envisioning perspective derived from the ideational apparatus of science, though not the necessarily only direction possibly taken. Ideally, the benefit and use of life is the underlying objective for the application of scientific knowledge, but that requires a comprehensive inclusive vision and valuation. Failure to accommodate and prioritize that moral connection comes in part from unrestricted application of the objective mode of consciousness to the whole of human experience. Indiscriminate amoral application of the powers of reason through science for technologically functional ends without widespread sensitivity and valuation of the interconnectedness of nature is a simple willingness to break faith, to harden the heart and abandon the fellowship of feelings. The subsequent assault upon humanity and rape of the environment arose because of failure to maintain a sense of balance and proportionality between material objectives and the wider connections between man and the world. If nature is presumed, through the prism of those with vested political and economic interests and wielding effective powers, to be simply a domain for exploitation, then technology can be ruthlessly directed for such short-term self-interested ends. And this is the path followed historically, when, once we elevate such a psychic mode to the highest cultural dignity, identifying it as the only intellectually productive way of addressing the universe, as legitimated through the scientific mode of envisioning reality, the modern West has played the conquering hero in its dealings with nature, attacking it with the sort of ferocity and wantonness that one only vents upon a foe little trusted and less to be pitied. And yet, that direction, though one logical outcome of a devalued sense of nature found simultaneously in some forms within the religious, philosophic and scientific traditions, was not inevitable. It has unfolded as it has because the prevailing intentions and ambitions to follow in that direction were legitimized within the dominant worldview. What can be recognized as breaking faith between human beings and their environment only maintains status as a moral issue when there is acknowledgement of independent value, worth, significance, respect, dignity, accorded that natural environment. When nature is legitimized as devoid of intrinsic quality and stature, as it was in particular religious, philosophic, scientific ideational configurations, then moral considerations must transcend the restrictive limitations of the dominant framework of envisioning and become more universal and transpersonal. And when human will is unrestricted in pursuing its objectives, a dimension of ambivalence and uncertainty remains part of the equation. There will indeed be knowledge, power, dominion without limit. We are licensed to unravel all mysteries. The veritable Pandora's box can lead to wonderful discoveries and significant benefits for mankind as well as to horrific or regrettable results. And with the ever-increasing sophistication of technology and of human knowledge, entirely unprecedented domains may become open to exploration, and in so doing, provoke the attendant moral issues surrounding man's efforts to remake the world, including human nature itself. If we need respect no obligations to nature, then the same one-dimensional application of human will runs the risk of perpetuating a similar exploitive and ultimately distorted human attitude to the natural world. For better and for worse then, in that context, it is simply the arena in which man plays out a Promethean role, and thus is envisioned as fundamentally malleable for whatever purposes those controlling knowledge and wielding power decide. Technology therefore becomes an extension of human will, intended to embody the knowledge of science for purposes determined by those who may or may not be themselves experts or grasp the entirety of the scope of operations, including all ramifications and implications of the technology. And when technology is applied to nature, a wide range of ethical concerns are implicitly raised, whether acknowledged or ignored, dealt with or dismissed. From the inner-directed orientation of the 20th century, recognition of both beneficial and destructive applications of technology is underscored by awareness that a more fundamental understanding of the relationship of man to nature is needed. The exclusive valuation of the rationalistic, empirical, intellectual mode of interpreting experience is seen as incomplete and misleading, in fact, incapable of providing the fullest knowledge of reality. And when nature is perceived solely from such an orientation, its richness, depth, vital connections are severely misconstrued. And technological exploitation simply compounds the errors inbuilt into the initial presumptions. And yet in itself, technology is not necessarily a negative force. It is the orientation taken, and the attitude adopted which determines if a destructive or enhancing end result will prevail. A number of idealistic perspectives emerged throughout the 20th century, in which technology, properly used and responsibly directed, was conceived as a potential extension of human capabilities, bringing with it opportunity for new kinds of benefits, knowledge, insight. Even as the evolution of industrialization unfolded over the centuries, there have been those who focused on the ideals of positive potential more than on the negative repercussions and implications. In the 19th century, we find a variety of envisioned utopian societies and communities, some purely theoretical, others used as models for actual experimentation. And that tradition continued into the 20th century, though changing in content and tone as world events and technology itself underwent radical transition and transformation. One of the more explicit mediums for speculating about the possible effects, positive and negative, of technology on human social life was the genre of science fiction. Growing from the 19th century ideational roots of Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, the revolutionary changes in 20th century technology provoked enormous speculation, ranging from stark doomsday visions to blissful material and spiritual utopias. In the following description, written near the start of the final quarter of the 20th century, we see this particular aspect of science fiction clearly enunciated. Science fiction contains the element of fantasy. It is this element that encourages exploration and imagination while it stimulates serious concentration on reality. Secondly, there is the element of speculation in which a present discovery or endeavor in science is projected and translated into a future possibility. Recent works emphasize the element of possibility and consider the effect of technology on individuals and society, concentrating on sociology and psychology, exploring inner space as well as outer space, and warning of possible future dangers. It is not merely escape literature that escapes into the isn't, or the never was, but literature that explores what just possibly might be. It is because of these elements that science fiction can be called a necessary literature of this time. Much of the science fiction literature of the first half of the 20th century dealt with extrapolating the possibilities inherent in the machines, gadgets, technologies, theories, of scientific endeavor, as well as pure imaginative construction. However, after the stark destructive potential of the atomic bomb was made manifest, all forms of speculation became much more cognizant of the social and moral implications of the powers of applied science. And with the intensification of space exploration and weapons development in the 1950s, 60s and 70s amidst the tensions of the Cold War, widespread awareness of some of the real potential dangers of technology became part of the everyday mindset. As well, though, the beneficially useful and life-enhancing effects were also felt throughout the century in a myriad of ways, radically transforming the everyday world in place at the end of the century from the one at the start. The enormous range of technological advancement in the 20th century is self-evident, including things from the proliferation of electricity to the applications of nanotechnology, and need not be dealt with as such. However, the rapid and revolutionary changes occurring over the century stimulated an ongoing adaptation and revision of ideational presumptions. Whether it was debate and speculation at the beginning of the 20th century about the implications of the new physics and applying the energies of electromagnetism, the mid-century critique of atomic weaponry or the implications of space exploration, the end-of-century reflection about the role of the computer or globalization, a certain ambivalence persisted about the place and purpose of technology. The personal and social spectrums encompassing the multiple domains of work, family life, health and nutrition, entertainment and leisure, communication, transportation, etc., virtually every sphere of life has been enormously impacted as a result of technology, and subsequently, provoke various evaluations, positive, negative, mixed. We have shown one perspective in which the dangers of an amoral uncommitted orientation are enunciated. Here is a view in which the negative factors are acknowledged, and suggests a fundamental change of envisioning values, dependent on a renewed sense of the sacred and extended view of consciousness. It comes from William Irwin Thompson, writing in the mid-1970s, at a time when the potential of space exploration was conditioned by awareness of the destructive forces of pollution and militarism. It typifies a particular theme, in which humanizing technology was explained as both a matter of a wider ethical valuation as well as a necessary prerequisite for a more ideal future. Modern man likes to think he has outgrown the age of morality and has replaced it with a positivistic social science. But secularization is merely a temporary and very necessary process to give new energies to the sacred and to release it from the prison of the old forms. The sacred is greater than the sacerdotal. If we look around us in contemporary culture, we see one of planetary remythologizing and re-enchantment. These energetic transformations are not coming from the elite culture of the scientific academies, they are coming from popular culture. If this attitude seems fanciful, one should stop to consider that all our technological solutions are only contributing to the problematique. There is no way that industrial society can solve the problems of industrial society. It is locked in a double bind in which all its quick fixes and solutions are negative feedback loops to nature and to culture. Though the resources of industrial society may be shrinking, the spiritual resources of nature are constantly expanding for planetary society. The people of the new culture realize that if we are going to humanize technology, we are going to have more than a world total state, we will need more than a political revolution. At the end of the line for industrial society, we discover that it's a spiral that we have turned and are now facing in the direction of cosmic mythology. This kind of assessment appeared from a number of perspectives, each proffering a particular reorientation and prioritization based on specific ideals and presumptions. The recognition of all types of worldwide social dysfunction during the century was expressed in terms of many specific crises, many of which concerned technologically related issues. Whichever terms and ideas were then at the forefront of the current thought of the times determined the tone and shape of the expressions, and established the framework of critique and argumentation. Any decade of the 20th century will reveal the envisioning of the debate in its own terms, although the issues themselves persist and acquire further degrees of significance as technology and knowledge evolve. The rapidly changing and constantly reconfigured ideational picture generated from the accumulated knowledge of science during the 20th century resulted in a number of popularized phrases, slogans and labels intended to easily characterize a dominant theme of the moment. The focus has constantly shifted during the second half of the 20th century, with such new idiosyncratic terms as atomic age, space age, futurology, information age, information superhighway, planetary society, ecological consciousness, technological society, modernity, consumer society, post-industrial society, synergy, general systems analysis, technetronic revolution, computer age, cybernetic revolution, artificial intelligence, holistic approach, Gaia consciousness, holographic universe, chaos theory, cyberspace, non-linear dynamics, virtual reality, hyperreality, etc., arising to redefine or interpret some aspect of technologically driven knowledge. Despite the continually revised framework of ideas, the basic issues pertaining to technology kept reappearing, adapted in the framework of the new terms and definitions. And ultimately, the fundamental ambivalent attitude was reflected within the various expressions of inner-directed envisioning. Idealization of a revised and humanized ethically grounded approach, cynicism and fear of the unchecked amoral mechanistically envisioned and justified perspective. The other focal point in the reaction to technology is most representatively expressed by the terms depersonalization, estrangement, alienation, anomie, bureaucratization. As technology and its influences became more and more prominent and dominant in everyday personal and social life, feelings of disconnectedness and powerlessness were recognized, becoming the subject matter for analyses, critique, aesthetic representation. In articulating the relationship between self and world, the influences of modern technology took on a new status, seen as further complicating the ideal of achieving satisfactory harmonization of subjective values within the more complex and increasingly ominous objective environment. William Barrett puts the issue into perspective in these words. The human subject lurking in the subject-object dualism that has shaped our modern epoch has not disappeared. Technical requirements have led us to quantify and calculate a great many more parts of life, but preoccupied as we may be with objects and data, the human subject is still there, restless and unappeased, haunting the edges of the technical world. In its lower manifestations, this subjectivism is the malaise of the mass, the lonely crowd, of the modern city, a malaise diffuse and inchoate, but sometimes desperately restless in its boredom. In its higher manifestations it is the subjectivity captured by modern art, complex and subtle, but also high-strung and alienated. This microcosmic personal orientation mostly focused on the perspective of the individual, and the difficulties in adequately attaining a fully meaningful life beset by the difficulties and complications of an intrusive technologically oriented and structured world. While the macrocosmic social and global orientation subsumes the personal in some ways, there yet remains a dimension of private personal, interior, concerns about values, meaning, purpose. And although the mainstream religious, philosophic and scientific traditions dealt with such issues from the context of their own bodies of knowledge and with their specific sets of premises, the unique circumstances and problems deriving from 20th century technology led to a quest for different, more relevant types of understanding. This led to both certain types of revision and adaptation within those frameworks as well as adoption of the non-traditional, non-ratiocentric inner-directed alternative orientations we are discussing. As well, the aesthetic medium became more central and prominent in dealing with the same underlying feelings pertaining to the relationship of the individual to the modern technologically determined world. The academic channels of the social sciences, particularly modern sociology, social psychology, political science, drew from the thought of Simmel, Weber, Mead, McDougall, Fromm, Marx, Althusser, etc. when treating the substance of the issues. From the position of religious considerations, Tillich and Bultmann were most influential in shaping the discussion of the role of the individual in the modern world. In philosophy, the existentialist perspective, both as a philosophical movement and as an attitude adopted towards envisioning reality, most closely reflected those concerns. From the academic and philosophic perspective, the term emerging most representative of the focus on discerning human values within the secularized technologically shaped modern world was hermeneutics. This definition reveals the type of technique applied in hermeneutical analyses. The art, skill, or theory of interpretation, or understanding the significance of human actions, utterances, products, and institutions. Basically, the hermeneutical approach is a matter of explication, of discerning human significance and meaning in the phenomena of personal and social existence. It isn't a precise mechanical scientific approach, or shaped by predetermined presumptions. In fact, it is a methodology largely dependent on the sensitivity and insight of the analyst, who must show sufficient art, skill, or theory of interpretation or understanding. Thus, in many of the academic and philosophic hermeneutical assessments of the role of man in modern society, we find very idiosyncratic and personalized forms of expression. The terminology applied, the perceived implications, the assessment of facts, the judgments of value, the speculative directions are all somewhat subjective. From the aesthetic perspective, the various individual arts produced their own schools and forms of expression, but often shared general empathy in tone and objectives. Though not necessarily institutions of explicit legitimation and ideational formulation, At times, the proliferation of supporting ideological manifestos and programs will turn the artistic into a semi-formal domain of knowledge. Particularly in the 20th century, when the ever-increasing availability of mass media access and dissemination of ideas, theories, intentions made the products of art more than primarily self-contained expressive vehicles and in some degree, turned them into forms of socially directed commentary. Of course, not all art was intended to serve as a reaction to the status of the evolving technological society of the 20th century, but much indeed was so motivated, either explicitly or subconsciously. For instance, the movement known as the avant-garde, in its various expressive incarnations and its supporting ideational rationale within the larger orientation of postmodernism, became synonymous with a revolt against mainstream traditional social values and ambitions. Within the entire range of artistic endeavors in the 20th century, the basic sense of the loss of value, meaning, fullest quality of life in a technologically prioritized society has often motivated the creators and found expression in their works. This definition of the continuity and evolution of modernism into the postmodern perspective clearly reveals the dynamics underlying the process of envisioning itself. Modernism was a movement of many segments, directions, and inner disputes, so is postmodernism. It is a still amorphous body of developments and directions marked by eclecticism, pluriculturalism, and often a post-industrial, high-tech frame of reference coupled with a skeptical view of technical progress. Like structuralism and deconstruction, it seems both to revolt against and seek to recover humanism. To date, it remains best seen as a complex map of late 20th century directions rather than a clear-cut aesthetic and philosophical ideology. As an orientation supporting both philosophical inquiry and aesthetic direction, we see postmodernism as a late 20th century evolution of that core attitude prevalent throughout the century. That skeptical view of technical progress was an ideational thread running through a number of channels, and while a revolt was yet motivated by the ideal of trying to seek to recover humanism. Although a still amorphous body of developments and directions, and cannot necessarily be categorized and classified as part of a single school or by uniform defining criteria, there is a plenitude of identifiable examples to be found throughout the technological era which express similar feelings and evoke empathetic tones. At the end of the 20th century, the eclecticism, pluriculturalism and often post-industrial high-tech frame of reference reflect a specific temporal cross-section of the components of this attitude. Those contents and criteria certainly may differ in terms of the specific type of data under scrutiny, and guiding perspectives of the early era of industrialization, or the height of mid-20th century Cold War angst. However, the common connecting ideational link is a fundamental suspicion of technology as ultimately debilitating and restrictive of full human potential and qualitative fulfillment when considered as an end unto itself, devoid of humanistic and moral prioritization. But when considered from a position in which those values and beliefs are given significance as guiding principles, technology itself could be used beneficently at large in the world and effectively serve to enhance the individual, fulfill spiritual and creative objectives. Another unique tendency in the inner-directed attitude to technology appeared during the last few decades of the 20th century. This was a positive valuation of the use of technology to effectively aid in the transformation of consciousness. Three major directions can generally be discerned where this intention was pursued. The first was an extension of popular, depth and transformational psychology objectives, where use of multimedia aids and scientifically designed machines or other apparatus was undertaken expressly to affect consciousness and psychological states. The second relates to the research, cultivation, synthesis, creation, distribution of mind-altering chemicals and substances. The third direction emerged out of the proliferation of ideas and lines of research triggered by the home computing revolution, as a number of new and interconnected concepts gained attention. In particular, the range of ideas associated with the terms cyberspace, and virtual reality. The underlying and connecting premise is that through the simulative capacities of increasingly powerful microcomputers, alternative realities, of one sort or another can be constructed and presented, virtually, to the observing mind, empathetically establishing a unique artificial environment, subjectively experienced through the participatory powers of the imagination, the senses, the intellect. The first use of technology we will look at as activator of shifts in consciousness pertains to the tools and machines specifically designed for that purpose. Some of these originated in clinical and laboratory settings. Others have been produced for use by the general public, often advertised as safe, easy, and dramatically effective. As well as serving that function, another repercussion of such applications and focus has been to place the question of consciousness into a broader perspective, where scientific knowledge and technology can be seen in light of the premises of more inner-directed envisioning. John White had this comment. Through Western technology, many Eastern religious practices that seem to verge on trickery are being validated and explained by hard data. Using such scientific equipment as the electrocardiograph (EKG) for measuring heart activity, the electroencephalograph (EEG) for measuring brain activity, the electromyograph (EMG) for measuring muscle activity, the electroculograph (EOG) for measuring eye muscle activity, audio oscillators, digital frequency discriminators, and omnidirectional tilt detectors, scientists can study what is going on inside the human organism. The technique is called physiological feedback, or biofeedback. The results of biofeedback experimentation so far indicate a hitherto overlooked human potential. Beyond that, the work seems to lead towards a marvelous convergence of science and religion. Written in 1970, we see a statement which summed up the state of pertinent knowledge to that date and suggested a direction for such continued research and experimentation in the future. The succeeding 3 decades indeed saw continued refinement and exploration of the ways scientific knowledge and technology could be used to study the functioning, and effect transitions, of consciousness. One of the more fruitful fields of application was in dream research, where more sophisticated instruments and methods of observation and experiment provided new insights into both the physiological and psychological dimensions of the dream experience. And perhaps the most intriguing inner-directed perspectives on dreams to appear since the Jungian theoretical framework was that of the positive valuation of the notion of lucid dreaming. With popular interest growing since the mid-1980s, largely based on the experiments and theories of Stefan Lauberg, an old persistent line of inner-directed belief acquired a new scientifically justified credibility. Through extensive scientifically controlled experimentation, a database of facts and theories emerged which concluded that authentic changes in consciousness occurred in lucid dreaming, and that the experiences could be important in affecting a fuller harmonious state of being. The belief that the dream state was one in which consciousness could be cognizant, alert, empowered to act and somewhat determine the contents of the experience has existed in many forms. It can be found in some shape or other in a plethora of mythologies, cultural expressions, religious notions, some philosophical speculation. Perhaps it has been most romanticized and idealized in a number of occult and esoteric traditions, often called astral traveling. As such, it has been a consistent element of many types of inner-directed envisioning, usually simply framed in the terminology and ideational system of the particular system, though generic notions have over the years infiltrated into the wider realm of popular thought. However, with the implicit wider-based legitimating esteem and respect of a scientific treatment, the subject matter acquired a more objective and appealing appearance. And when presented as a viable and easily accessible means of enriching life and integrating personality, appeal to this natural biological transition of consciousness became a significant inner-directed theme. Lauberg presented this point of view in stating the benefits of cultivating and practicing the lucid dreaming process. Quote, Fortunately, it now seems possible for ordinary dreamers to learn to have lucid dreams much more frequently than would normally occur by chance. Thanks largely to recently developed techniques, you can probably learn to have them whenever and as often as you like, if you are willing to practice. The fact that lucid dreaming is indeed a learnable skill keeps alive the hope that the lucid dreaming state may prove to have wide applications. Almost all of them depend upon your having a desire to go further in your life. This may take the form of longing for a richer, wider variety of experience, looking for a challenge, or wanting to discover who you really are. Perhaps you have developed, as Baudelaire put it, a taste for the infinite. Or perhaps you have your heart set upon the discovery and actualization of hidden talents. You may feel that your life is empty of meaning, or that you are out of touch with yourself. Perhaps you want to reconcile or heal some division you feel in yourself. You might suffer from terrifying nightmares and yearn to sleep peacefully, without fear. Perhaps you feel lost, inadequate, or depressed, or simply curious to explore the adventures of the dream world. The appeal to self-improvement, spiritual goals, a sense of adventure are the typical themes in stimulating interest in many inner-directed and self-help systems, traditions, ideas. What is important to note as well is that though the cultivation and practice of lucid dreaming per se is not dependent on extraneous tools or devices, these indeed are often presented as useful aids or adjuncts to some phase of the transformational process. The scientific foundation of the modern theories of lucid dreaming are crucially dependent on the technological instruments of the experimentational and observational process. As well, on a broader popular level, other tools and products of technology are likewise presented as capable of either helping or directly triggering transformations of consciousness. Lauberg, for instance, has marketed an audio tape called Controlling Your Dreams, as well as a variety of electronic computer chip-controlled devices for use in triggering and recalling lucid dream events. That is just one example of how inner-directed ideas may extend into the world of technology for support and supplementation. We will pick up this line of discussion again in a moment. Moving from the use of technology in the study and cultivation of the dream state, we can look at a different sort of application of scientific means and materials. Perhaps some of the more adventuresome examples of how the use of technology can aid in transformation of consciousness came from John Lilly in reflecting upon his various experiences and experiments. In this description of his experience in a sensory deprivation flotation tank, we see the results of this particular approach. After a good deal of such technical matters, I was finally able to reach a state of suspended neutral buoyancy just below the surface of the water in the tank. Later, such experiences and experiments were called sensory deprivation. At no time did I find any deprivation effect. In the absence of all stimulation, it was found that one quickly makes up for this by an extremely heightened awareness and increasing sensory experience in the absence of any known means to external stimulation. One did not need external stimulation to stay awake. After a few tens of hours of experiences, I found phenomena that had been previously described in various literatures. I went through dreamlike states, trance-like states, mystical states. In all of these states, I was totally intact, centered and there. At no time did I lose conscious awareness of the facts of the experiment. Some part of me always knew that I was suspended in a water tank in the dark and in the silence. It was only later in reading the literature that I found that the states I was getting into resembled those attained by other techniques. The logistics of using this type of methodology as a means of transforming consciousness are clearly complex, requiring access to equipment and conditions not easily attainable by the average person. The same circumstances were largely true regarding a number of other devices, such as EEG machines and various biofeedback devices. However, with the revolutionary advances in computational knowledge and technology during the last decades of the 20th century, A number of machines, gadgets, and tools began to emerge claiming the same sort of consciousness-affecting potency. We have earlier mentioned in discussion of lucid dreaming the appearance of technological aids and adjuncts directed towards, and marketed for, the general public. The common connecting link is the belief that these devices are efficacious in one way or another of changing psychological moods or states of consciousness. Though not exclusively, many of these materials are based on the foundation established in biofeedback research, and in various ways, try to emulate similar functions. Perhaps the methodology most modeled is that of brainwave entrainment. A variety of audio materials encoded with the frequencies pertaining to desired alpha, theta or delta states of brainwave activity have appeared which, in various combinations and sequences, are intended to lock into and direct the subject through desired changes in consciousness or mood. This technology may or may not be combined with subliminal messaging, spoken narration or direction, musical accompaniment. This approach is more extensively enacted with personal use mini-computer controlled, brainwave, machines. The basic purpose underlying the many specific devices is to provide an immersive synchronized entrainment experience, which may be programmed in innumerable ways to achieve the desired effect. These machines generate the range of desired frequencies both as aural tones and binaural beats heard through headphones and as visual frequencies emitted as pulsing light patterns sensed with closed eyes through eye goggles. The programming of these machines may be customized for a variety of needs. Some such uses are for increased focus on desired goals, energy boosts, better concentration and retention of knowledge, relaxation, elimination of stress, increase memory and cognitive ability, help in sleeping, tranquility, support of the disciplines of meditation, enhancement of spiritual receptivity, stimulation of creativity, the more efficient coping with physical and psychological problems, sensory enhancement, multimedia, entertainment, and so on. Michael Hutchison, a major proponent of these tools in the 1980s and 90s, envisioned them as a significant component of a more inner-directed life, expecting their application to grow in the future, as he wrote in 1994. Mind machines seem futuristic, but in this case the future is here today. These high-tech brain tools exist now, and hundreds of rigorous scientific studies have proven beyond doubt their capacity to enhance mental functioning, boost brain power, and quickly produce peak performance brain states. New evidence of the enormous powers of brain machines is emerging at an accelerating rate. Many scientists are engaged in groundbreaking research into the effects of these brain tech systems, and their reports reveal a growing sense of excitement, a feeling that brain technology represents something truly unprecedented. The belief that brainwave entrainment can be facilitated through these devices supports the premise that changes in consciousness can be primarily or secondarily effected through the aid of technology, whether directly or in a supporting role. And thus, when science is perceived as a benign enterprise, the research, development, production of more refined and efficient tools like these is considered an inner-directed and morally justifiable activity. Looking at the application of technology intended as a direct means of influence on psychological states, it may be feasible to strictly classify the wide range of pharmaceutical products explicitly designed to affect consciousness in this category. This would include not just the natural and synthetic materials recognized as hallucinogenic and the variety of medically or otherwise designed mood-altering drugs, but many of the modern herbal-based stress management, relaxation, stimulant-oriented, or brain-enhancing products. The influence of 20th-century technology is a significant factor in the proliferation and production of these materials, thus logically classified in this context. The role of technology can be seen just about anywhere, from innovations in agricultural cultivation to the uses of advanced chemical knowledge and techniques to new methods of synthesis to extended methodologies in research to the expanded and streamlined means of production and distribution. Looked at collectively, though there may be dramatic differences in their compositional structures, how they work, in their actual effects. The common theme underlying the diverseness is that they all are intended to change psychological states in one way or another, and have, through 20th century technology, become more refined, intentionally designed, integrated into public consciousness. Of course, reflecting a wide spectrum of opinion about the respective merits or dangers of each particular product. From the inner-directed perspective, there also has existed a diversity of evaluative considerations. Generally, the more organic and natural products intended as beneficial adjuncts to a healthy lifestyle have been credibly endorsed. For example, within the broad holistic approach to life, there often will be factored in the positively esteemed and valued use of herbal or other natural substances for purposes of affecting psychological moods or mental faculties. Recognition of the historic traditions of such applications as well as use for purely medicinal and healing purposes served as a foundation for more modern technologically enhanced productions. And from this context, there is often an equally negative reaction to the effects of unprincipled amoral technological domination of the environment. Escape from this alienating and damaging presence is in part effected through the wise use of herbal supplements or substances. And the stress and strain on the personal psyche is in part beneficently alleviated through their inclusion as part of the normal daily routine. A sympathetic orientation to a more natural, simpler, holistic and basic lifestyle, sometimes characterized as a back to nature outlook, is consistently a theme in this configuration of the inner-directed ideational mix. These words are a representative example of that outlook. As we approach the 21st century, we live in a world of stress, pollution, lack of meaning and lack of purpose. In the face of such a cultural alienation from nature, the plethora of diseases assailing the civilized world should come as no surprise. To heal these ills, the underlying causes must first be addressed, and these causes are not only within the individual but within our culture as a whole. When attention is given to appropriate support for the body under stressful conditions, nature comes to our rescue. Technically, what is needed is an increase in nonspecific resistance to damaging man-made factors and illnesses. A range of herbal remedies are coming to light that do this, as well as advances in research and technology directed towards providing medicinally based antidotes for specific illnesses. Part of the equation in the relief from stress involves the effecting of more serene, calm, invigorating, creative, stimulating or insightful psychological states. As well, the emergence of a class of brain foods, specifically engineered to effect such transitions, can be recognized as another phase of this approach. The prioritization of these smart drugs and nutrients is primarily directed to the cognitive side of mental activity. With the expansion of knowledge in the field of neuroscience in the late 20th century, the capability of designing supplements for such specific intentions was advanced beyond anything previous in that direction. The promotion of PHSRMaceuticals to that end is exemplified in this statement. By using newly researched nutrients, new compounds, and test-proven pharmaceuticals, you may vastly increase your brain power and improve your memory, concentration, and ability to learn. And those scientific advances in knowledge and technology are clearly evident in the field of neuroscience, manifesting in a variety of such products and endeavors. When directed to more explicitly controversial uses, a more dubious aura remains surrounding the subject matter. Scientific interest in mind-expanding, psychoactive, hallucinogenic substances was perceived as relatively credible and legitimate until the controversial eruption of countercultural focus during the mid-1960s. Laboratory, clinical and academic study suddenly was reconsidered in the light of ongoing sociological events, and acquired an entirely new contextual significance. A prevalent fear grew in certain social sectors and institutions of widespread indulgence, leading to a quasi-anarchist revolt against the status quo, and the subsequent implications of a radically re-envisioned and reprioritized perspective of reality. Fueled by often sensationalistic and misleading popular media interpretations and assessments, the neutral and objective study of psychoactive materials became a problematic enterprise. Shades of the hostile and cynical tone engendered under those 1960s circumstances lingered throughout the rest of the century, though research and analysis continued in a variety of shapes and forms, each differing in credibility and plausibility. A spectrum ranging from the primarily scientific and objectively neutral to the proactive interests of users and producers. Here is the view of Andrew Weil, coming in 1990, reflecting upon the still emotion-tinged, distorted framework of the traditional scientific approach. Quote, "People always see the universe through their own perceptual filters, which have to do with their needs and fears. In many areas of inquiry, the intensity of emotion may be muted enough that the distortions of observations are not that great. But in any area where emotion is a major element, distortions become very great, and science becomes as distorted as anything else. Research on drugs is abominable, the quality of investigation in the area of psychoactive drugs is terrible. The simplest kinds of rules of logic are violated in papers that get published in leading journals that are supposed to be pure of view. There is a long history of this problem, which can be simply stated as, when one culture is afraid of certain drugs, there is an unconscious need to find damaging evidence against those substances. Experiments are then designed to produce information that seemingly confirms the seated beliefs and fears. On the other hand, when we look at the drugs that our society approves and encourages the use of, we are inclined not to look for harmful effects, even when harmful effects are staring you right in the face. This kind of attitude was a common inner-directed approach to the very issue of mind-expanding substances. It implies lack of real impartial factual knowledge, a warped set of starting premises, a predilection to look for, emphasize, and possibly exaggerate the most negative factors, and a double standard, even if implicit. However, from the other side of the argument, claims would also be made of an equally biased and self-interested filtering and conceptualizing process. And critiques and apologies came from the entire spectrum of ideational and social interests. Psychedelic experience became part of the common parlance of the times, and both positively and negatively treated, has had a widespread and lasting influence. Considered as products of modern scientific synthesis or natural substances cultivated through the tools and techniques of modern technology, their intended purpose as external stimuli is to effect a relatively immediate transition of consciousness. As such, the objective of triggering the experience is an end unto itself, but the real desired value is attaining that transition of consciousness. The major differences between those promulgating such substances and those of more traditional spiritual orientations were twofold. The first difference was that to many, using such stimuli was thought to be a shortcut to deep insight and value. That without a necessary ethos of working towards its attainment, or earning the opportunity for progressive unfolding of a deeper, more intense kind of transformative experience, it lacks a proper foundation. Whatever new state of consciousness may appear will be improperly understood and superficially comprehended. And the second line of such criticism was that the experience itself was intrinsically counterfeit, delusional, a shadow of the more substantive and fully authentic mystical or spiritual realization. And the concluding judgment from that type of critique was ultimately a moral conclusion. That even when there may arise a sophisticated theoretical edifice of explanation and justification, the bottom line remains that a simple intentional initiating act induced the intended transition indiscriminately for anyone with access to the stimuli. The most well-known and discussed form of this practice is the ingestion of mind-altering chemicals to trigger transitions in states of consciousness. Particularly the category of hallucinogenic substances. Although these substances have often been applied in controlled settings for premeditated ends, no requisite preparation or practice is necessary for the transition in consciousness to occur. That simply is a causal result of external substance affecting receptive body. Individuals may be well versed in religious, philosophic, scientific knowledge, have extensive experience with body and mind disciplines. However, none of that actually triggers the transition in modes of experience. Of course, the context of application and degree of individual preparation does help shape and define the presentment and the interpretation of the experience. How it is felt, how it is perceived, implications drawn, connections formed from the experience vary from person to person. Yet nonetheless, the objective of achieving that transition, on demand, could only be effected via external stimuli. As to the actual substance of the so-called drug-induced transition of consciousness, that remains a controversial topic of discussion. There has been a wide spectrum of interpretations, ranging from the entirely hallucinatory and delusional, to the purely mystical and transcendental. In some contexts, value is measured pragmatically as well as absolutely. In therapeutic use, for instance, by how effectively overall treatment was helped or hindered. In more religious settings, value is measured by degree of spiritual insight and enhancement of transcendent feelings. The philosophical measure may be found in the types of new intuitions and self-world perceptions. The scientific value could be inferred from observation and experiment under unique kinds of subjective conditions. The aesthetic value can be found in the expansion of the palette of sensations, feelings, suggested lines of thought. All in all, whatever the purpose and background of the individual, whatever the context for desiring a transition of consciousness, wherever the line between hallucinatory and ontologically authentic falls, relatively immediate actualization occurs through external means of inducement. The presence of mind-altering stimuli is evident throughout history in a variety of cultures. Most closely connected with religious custom and ritual, both the socially dominant and more peripheral varieties. And in some cultures, the use of mind-altering substances has been legitimized and sanctioned within predefined social boundaries. However, the focus on using such substances as a tool for individual exploration really was a byproduct of the Romantic movement. The glorification of the types of feelings, sensations, state of consciousness was expressed in aesthetic and personal terms, not confined to doctrinaire classifications and judgments. Through the early part of the 20th century, the recognition and validation of mind-altering substances was mostly contained to the artistic environment. By the mid-1950s, the prevailing social climate of Western society became more open to countercultural, anti-establishment currents of thought. First, amongst the beatnik ethos, and a decade later, much more explicitly as part of the hippie orientation. The dominating theme in that particular validation of mind-altering substances was that they were a means of immediately achieving a breakthrough in consciousness, a doorway to discovering an authentic spiritual reality underlying the world of appearances. However, the experience itself was manifold, an uncontrolled mix of personal and collective unconscious materials, as well as episodes or flashes of more alleged extended and transcendent content. To some, the experience was terrifying and destructive. To others, deeply satisfying and enlightening. And many expressed mixed positive and negative reaction. However, whether perceived as negative, positive, or in between, any potential subject was able to gratify curiosity, experiment, indulge personal whims, fulfill deep-seated aspirations through externally triggered immediate change in consciousness. The inner-directed legitimating foundation drew from all these sources, using supporting materials wherever they seemed to fit. And as the century progressed, a number of key authoritative spokespeople articulated a general position, which was amplified, augmented, reconfigured over the years by others. The first inner-directed esteemed authoritative exposition came in Aldous Huxley's essays, The Doors of Perception, and Heaven and Hell, first published in the mid-1950s and reprinted many times afterwards, especially in the 1960s. Huxley's assessment of the equable nature of externally induced and traditionally initiated transitions in consciousness are expressed in these words. Knowing as he does, or at least as he can know, if he so desires, what are the chemical conditions of transcendental experience, the aspiring mystic should turn for technical help to the specialists, to pharmacology, in biochemistry, in physiology and neurology, in psychology and psychiatry and parapsychology. And on their part, of course, the specialists, if any of them aspire to genuine men of science and complete human beings, should turn, out of their respective pigeonholes, to the artist, the sibyl, the visionary, the mystic, all those, in a word, who have experience of the other world and who know, in their different ways, what to do with the experience. This clear appeal to technical help towards achieving a transition to transcendent experience set the tone for similar speculative excursions throughout the rest of the century. Perhaps the three most prominent public exponents of that viewpoint at various points during that span were Alan Watts, Timothy Leary and Terence McKenna. Watts, though many others weighed in on the issues from a number of different positions. A seminal document representative of the psychedelic orientation towards the activation of transitions of consciousness was the book, The Joyous Cosmology, by Watts. Published in 1962, it, along with the works of Huxley, helped establish a popularly disseminated ideational framework upon which subsequent speculation would soon follow. In the foreword to the book, Leary and Richard Alpert argue for a new re-envisioning of reality based on the insights of transcendental experience, which they feel is accessible to anyone willing to use the psychoactive substance triggering substance. And ultimately, they feel the results of such experience will lead to widespread inner-directed prioritization in the various phases of life. Where do we go from here? What is the application of these new wonder medicines? The answer will come from two directions. We must provide more and more people with these experiences and have them tell us what they experienced. We must also encourage systematic objective research by scientists who have taken the drug themselves and have come to know the difference between inner and outer, between consciousness and behavior. Such research should explore the application of these experiences to the problems of modern living, in education, religion, creative industry, creative arts. There are many who believe that we stand at an important turning point in man's power to control and expand his awareness. Our research provides tentative grounds for such optimism. And in the prologue of the book, Watts reiterates the need of science to cooperate in supplying access to the keys which can open the door to a less restricted, more authentic experience of reality. He said it this way: "Is it possible, then, that Western science could provide a medicine which would at least give the human organism a start in releasing itself from its chronic self-contradiction? The medicine might indeed have to be supported by other procedures, psychotherapy, spiritual disciplines, and basic changes in one's pattern of life, but every diseased person seems to need some kind of initial lift to set him on his way to health. The question is by no means absurd if it is true that what afflicts us is a sickness not just of the mind but of the organism, of the very functioning of the nervous system and the brain. Is there, in short, a medicine which can give us temporarily the sensation of being integrated, of being fully one with ourselves and with nature? If so, the experience might offer clues to whatever else must be done to bring about full and continuous integration." These kinds of enthusiastic optimistic proselytizing about the benefits of an experientially legitimated, chemically induced, transcendentally cognizant society was one facet of the inner-directed orientation, and was met largely by hostility and cynicism from authoritative social institutions and representative of mainstream thought and opinion at large. And it presumed that the conventional way of envisioning and experiencing reality was in some way diseased, requiring the need of transformative medicine to reveal a truer state of being. And though generally provoking mainstream negative reaction, it did empathetically resonate in some ways with a largely youthful minority alternative segment of the populace. Many of the ideals, ideas and beliefs were perpetuated throughout the various artistic media, and a renewed interest in esoteric and other inner-directed subjects was stimulated. And this view of psychedelic substances serving a corrective function, revealing a more transcendent status behind the world of everyday appearances, was a popular inner-directed theme throughout the century. Many different presentations, with a variety of nuanced perspectives, emerged after the 1960s. Perhaps one of the most popular and radical expositors was Terence McKenna, who used a variety of media to express his thoughts about the nature of reality, the role of mind-altering substances, the nature of consciousness, the destiny of civilization, and other topics. However, despite extensive hypothetical explorations along intriguing theoretical lines, yet retained the fundamental belief that the transition of consciousness effected by psychoactive substances was a crucial and necessary stimulus to dispel the illusion of the reality perceived in ordinary experience. He wrote these words: "To see the picture clearly, you must break out of the flat cultural illusion and rise up to look at the situation. That is why psychedelics are so important. They raise you out of the historical matrix, giving you a sense of participation in a transcendental reality. Psychedelics catalyze the imagination. They drive you to think what you did not think otherwise. By perceiving the uses and products of science and technology in this context as basically tools or blueprints for purposes of consciousness transformation, we see one particular path of inner-directed envisioning. However, the objective of using technology to effect a transition in consciousness and provide alternate realities moved in another direction in the last 2 decades of the 20th century. While mind-altering substances triggered a transition in consciousness biologically, the tools and techniques pertaining to experiencing alternative realities are likewise products of technology. Immediate transition to a cyberspace environment occurs through the activation of computing tools and products. And though the type of change in consciousness is different than that effected through mind-altering substances, it is yet a legitimate shift. And both share the connection of requiring only physical activation to induce the specific change in consciousness. Jaron Lanier, the father of virtual reality, describes the differences between the states of consciousness in these words. For one thing, virtual reality doesn't involve a sudden change in one's state of consciousness. It might involve a gradual one or an eventual one, but in terms of the state of consciousness, going from being in a normal waking state to going into virtual reality, it's continuous. Your subjective experience changes slowly and gradually. A psychedelic drug operates directly on your brain, changing your subjective perception. Virtual reality only happens outside your sense organs, so it only directly addresses what you objectively perceive. And yet, with the mass media popularization of the term and all associated connotations relating to cyberspace, much inner-directed speculation focused on the nature and quality of such experiences, and the possibilities and potential inherent in the technology. Interestingly, many veteran psychedelic gurus quickly jumped on the bandwagon, conceiving of virtual reality as a logical succession in the means of providing access to alternate realities, as augmentation to use of psychoactive substances. Here is a sampling of how such proactive psychedelic supporters as Timothy Leary, Robert Anton Wilson and Terence McKenna perceived computer-generated virtual reality in cyberspace. First, Leary speaking in 1988. The glory of the information society is that everything in the universe is made up of probabilities, screens, bits of units of quanta. Through Heisenberg's research we know that it is our own minds, our own instruments, which determine the reality we study. The meta-idea from Hindu and Buddhist philosophy has become one of the canons of quantum physics and can be implemented by anyone who knows how to access the new cybernetic appliances. I think that's neat. Yes, the key idea is the idea of cyber. The idea of cyber involves individuals navigating their own way through the info world. The information age frees the individual. It is only the individual who experiences the body. I am talking about the cybersomatic individual who pilots his own body, consciously, intentionally. The cyber-electronic person who creates his own film, his life scripts, and who controls what is on his screen. The way to get information is not from government, the static states, the party line, but from other cyber individuals. This is strengthened by using technology that is humane and functional. The cyber world is a world of cooperation, assertion and versatility, and not the old world of submission and/or aggression. Within 20 years the cyber society will evolve. It will be very different than what you see before us today. You see, the key here is user-friendly technology. The key is putting your ideas on screen. It is an irresistible notion. We will simply love directing and editing our own scripts, our own lives. We will begin to select our own future. We will be as gods. The mix of metaphors, analogies, and references to modern physics, Eastern thought, informational, technological, media, and entertainment sources is a good example of how associated interdirected notions are merged and blended into an overall envisioned picture of a specific kind of reality, though essentially solipsistic in visualizing a society of self-directing, self-absorbed monads linked by mutual self-interests. It yet crucially depends on humane and functional technology to actually be efficacious. An interdirected cyber society will have to prioritize explorations of all dimensions of consciousness and subjective experience, designing the pertinent technology as an extension of the will and supplement of the body. Robert Anton Wilson in 1990 had this assessment of what virtual reality could become in the future. Personally, I see the ultimate implications of virtual reality as a kind of techno-zen. When we can change realities as easily as we now change TV channels, the Buddhist detachment from fixed ideas will become an intuitively obvious goal for all, and a goal easily attained. To explain the revolutionary potentials of that seemingly innocent remark, let me say it otherwise. The most important discovery of modern neuroscience, I think, consists of the discovery that every reality we perceive create has emerged from an ocean of more or less random signals, which our brain has edited, organized, and orchestrated into what social scientists call glosses, or frames, reality tunnels in Tim Leary's wonderful coinage. Due to the speed of conditioned reflexes, we do not even notice our role as co-creators of these reality tunnels. Thus, we all have what Buddhists call fixed ideas. Learning a new art or science requires what psychologists call reframing. To grow means to reframe, or to change reality tunnels. And of course, the fastest, most dramatic technique for entering alternative realities not only derives from shamanism but uses psychoactive substances, drugs. The government itself has declared war on those who use this technique of reframing. None of these prejudices can obstruct the use of virtual reality. It does not require a lot of hard work, like yoga. And it clearly teaches the same lesson as all the shamans and yogis since the dawn of time. You create one reality tunnel at a time out of a phalanx of possible reality tunnels. You can learn to change your reality tunnel. You can experience many reality tunnels as a felt experience, not just an abstract idea. The Zen detachment from fixed dogmas and fixed emotions will become available to millions as cyberspace technology spreads through computer games, through entertainment, through education and business, into every aspect of our society. Once more we see the same type of appeal to a synthesis of interdirected lines of thought. Modern science, Eastern ideas and techniques, non-industrial cultural influences, psychedelic activators, a vision of benign technology and multimedia products clearly used in the service of the individual as a means of changing reality configurations. As well, we again have another quasi-solipsistic picture of society as a collection of discrete units, with each individual pursuing private interests and intent on creating personal self-subsistent, reality tunnels. Technology again is placed in the foundational position, designed, crafted and honed to provide easy and immediate access for shifts in the orientation of consciousness. And Terence McKenna had these observations from the same year, dismissing the more prosaic, obvious, and commercial applications and hypothesizing about more deep-rooted possibilities. The ambiguity of invisible meanings which attend audio speech is replaced by the unambiguous topology of meanings beheld. At last we will truly see what we mean. And we will see what others mean too, for cyberspace will be a dimension where anything that can be imagined can be made to seem real. When we are in the act of seeing what is meant, the communicator and the one communicated with become as one. In other words, the visible language possible in virtual reality will overcome the subject-object dualism as well as the self-other dualism. Finally, virtual reality, with its capacity for virtual replay of constructions of the imagination, may hold the key to accessing the mapping of the imagination. The more extreme, inventive and avant-garde of the virtual reality constructions are likely to resemble experiences with psychedelic plants and drugs rather than the more conventional forms of art. The doorway to the realms of dream and the unconscious will be opened, and what had been merely symbolic representations of eccentric individual experience will become the experience itself. My hope for virtual reality would be that exploration of such new frontiers of language and communication could be built into the research strategies from the start. Then the loop from the trivial to the archetypal might be appreciably shortened as the virtual reality options become well known. A major career option of the near-term future is that of professional cyberspace architect-engineer. Such folk will design and direct the construction of virtual realities and scenarios. Consciousness is no better than the quality of the codes that convey it. Virtual reality may hold the possibility of an icon-based visual language that could be universally understood while being much more wide-spectrum in its portrayal of emotions and spatial relationships than is even theoretically possible for spoken language. Ultimately, it again is the professional architect-engineer who is entrusted with the design and construction of virtual realities and scenarios. Implicit trust and faith is presumed in the beneficial applications of technology and the motives and abilities of the elite specialists who craft and create the hardware and software. As such, hypothetically the potential exists for virtual reality to significantly affect shifts in consciousness, perception, cognizance, understanding. Having briefly looked at how virtual reality was perceived by some of the more well-known proponents of the psychoactive substance methodology, we see that it is basically considered as an alternative means of embarking upon another form of consciousness expansion. Let us now briefly examine some of the characteristics of this distinctive form of experience. The apparatus of the computer serves as a tool used in establishing the parameters and presenting the substance of each of the particular types of realities. These virtual worlds are modeled on particularly represented and evaluated interpretations of specific human interests, behaviors, logical patterns of response and reaction. The participating individual is thus presented with the means of projecting subjectivity in a number of different ways into an artificial but entrancing environment. The more realistically the subject is drawn into the environment, the more likely the possibility of immersing subjectivity within the simulation and enacting with more spontaneity. The fully engaged subject thus has opportunity to interact imaginatively, forgetting himself, as the self-conscious physical presence and acting with more instinctual and intuitive immediacy. Of course the virtual worlds are artificial, but as are the imagined and constructed universes of myth, art, literature, their invitation is for the mind to engage and creatively participate. Participation occurs through the interface, the redefined analogy of the triggering mechanism or doorway for the transition of consciousness. Michael Heim characterizes it in these words. In the information age, a mystic glow surrounds the term cyberspace. Every type of interface forms a window or doorway into cyberspace. Cyberspace suggests a computerized dimension where we move information about and where we find our way around data. Cyberspace renders a represented or artificial world, a world made up of the information that our systems produce and that we feed back into the system. The computer interface holds its field of moves, hierarchies of files, places to go, and relative distances between points of interest. We inhabit cyberspace when we feel ourselves moving through the interface into a relatively independent world with its own dimensions and rules. The more we habituate ourselves to an interface, the more we live in what William Gibson calls the consensual hallucination. The interface brings with it a troubling ambiguity. How peripheral is the human? How much of the system do we own when we enter the door of cyberspace? Where are we when software architects shape the datascape into endless mazes of light attracting us like moths to a flame? This facet of cyberspace, perhaps more ambiguous and problematic, suggests an implicit sense of confusion when the boundary between artificial realities and the physical world are less distinctly articulated. A purely virtual and delimited environment maintains its own boundaries. The subjects enact, within that world, and acknowledge the implicit, play, or fantasy factor is intrinsic to that environment. However, projection of subjectivity within the domains of a more fluid universe of electronic representation and communication may lead to a more chaotic and unstructured fragmentation of identity. Cybersurfing is an apt metaphor indicating how the participating subject can rapidly and randomly enter self-contained domains of specialized ideas and discrete intentions. As simple vehicle of consciousness, the surfing mind can passively absorb, act, react independently in each environment. But when multiple subjects interact through their cyber selves at the same location, each self becomes temporarily stabilized and defined by their public persona in that specific context. Particular prioritizations of interests and displays of personality traits coalesce as befitting each specific environment. And with no hindrance from the physical body, or spatial restraints, or feedback from real-world contact, a multiplicity of projections may appear, each reflecting a specific mix of both real and imaginary personality traits. Projection can be relatively superficial and benign, when self-consciousness remains active and self spontaneously projects into cyber-self. Yet the opportunity also exists for those willful or compelled to use the cyber medium as a vehicle for more extensive selfish or malevolent psychological projection. Ironically, Heim diverges from some of those who envisioned a seamless inner-directed ideational continuity between most of the significant threads. For instance, where some see the cyberspace experience incongruous continuity or empathetically similar to the general Eastern orientation, Wilson sees it leading in the opposite direction, creating a troubling gulf between the basic ontological facts of bodily existence and the essentially self-contained domain of subjective indulgence. He writes, "We do not even realize when we are trapped in our minds and cyber streams. The basic world we incarnate gradually is lost in our attention to the cognitive and imagined worlds. To offset the loss, we need to preserve what remains of the wisdom of Far Eastern philosophy, particularly Taoism with its profound system of internal body awareness. Eastern philosophy has always sought to unify the mind and the body, to harmonize outer and inner. So in essence, cyberspace, in its varied forms remains a channel by which the subject can voluntarily escape, virtually, in mind, from its confines as the persona, the social self, the familiar ego, and appear as imagined or spontaneously expressed in artificial, but legitimate environments of intentional thought and behavior. The subjective self may choose a shift to a more self-contained world, or any number of publicly shared environments. And when engaged, the bodily apparatus recedes as the mind attains a more self-subsistent, temporarily detached autonomy. As such, this is a legitimate change of consciousness, though neglect of the bodily and the physical stratum will distort and delude in the way reality is envisioned. But, paradoxically, the enhanced possibilities of self-expression and a conscious plurality of choices, apart from the body, provide a means of envisioning consciousness as more extensive and multifaceted than it would appear otherwise in the context of a normal life. We have mentioned that only in the 20th century has the idea of the unconscious as a distinct entity, either as fact or hypothesis, explicitly filtered into the majority Western frameworks of representational reality. We have seen in discussion of the premises of the philosophical and scientific criteria of legitimization, that preeminent value was placed on rationality, the ego, reason, exercise of consciousness and will, conceptual knowledge, sense observation, and so on. Though of course each system and representation differs, by and large, the worth, significance, use of what would be seen as subconscious experience is often expressed as significantly inferior to the forms of rationality. And that in the framework of Christianity, phenomena and experiences of a non-rational nature were either placed within a category sanctified within the traditional boundaries of faith if deemed positive and faith-affirming, or else likewise categorized and classified negatively if perceived as threatening. Either side of the equation within the familiar system of ideas and beliefs. Though notable exceptions existed before then, it was only in the 19th century that the unconscious was treated more objectively and as a source of possible insight into the fuller nature of human experience and existence. Schopenhauer, von Hartmann, James, Myers, Wundt and others began serious and sometimes systematic investigation of the phenomena of the unconscious. Philosophical, medical, scientific, including the new science of psychology, approaches all helped articulate a vocabulary and database of information and theory. And by the time Freud conducted his studies, the subject matter was becoming demystified and accessible to study and speculative treatment. Freud, a product of 19th-century positivist science, attempted to treat the fluid and imaginative subject matter as if it were containable and decipherable within a strict mechanistic methodology. Despite some of the inbuilt limitations of this approach, his systematic classifications and definitions provided a foundation for future studies. The description of a blind, striving, sexually grounded libidinal energy force as the essential characteristic of the unconscious helped open up to study forms of experience previously repressed, ignored, misrepresented. The domain of the subjective was able to include phenomena of dreams, fantasy, repressed and sublimated energies, hidden, motivation, etc. as part of its subject matter. And, despite the questionable long-term validity of each theory, the pioneering effort of Freud allowed the unconscious to become an accepted part of the envisioning of reality, and to provide a vehicle for others to work with as well. The influence of Freud in the areas of ethics, interpersonal and family relationships, the fields of psychiatry and pathology, the arts, humanities, social studies etc. has been widespread both directly and through the ideas of others, many of whom have radically revised or completely abandoned Freud's basic theories. One concept emerging from Freudian thought and radically revised and reformulated was the notion of depth in the human personality. It was just one of the innovative concepts expounded upon by Carl Jung and others. While Freud visualized the unconscious largely in clinical and pathological terms, Jung extrapolated a wider range of possible meaning and connectivity, focusing on the role of the unconscious as a component of the self, striving to full integration and recognition of purpose and value. As such, the processes and phenomena of the subconscious were not only manifestations of biological and instinctual stimuli, but were of a more extensive and diverse nature. Depth, extended beyond the day-to-day content of the individual ego, but to deeper levels of personality. And a hypothesis of a common, collective unconscious, which both was the source of collective as well as personal values and meaning, expressed symbolically both personally and in cultural form. The conception of the Jungian unconscious thus is both subconsciously grounded in personal terms as well as transpersonal and a part of the larger fabric of being. And the latter hypothesis includes characteristics of value and purpose as part of the nature of reality. The Jungian school has had a wide influence in many fields, especially over the last half of the 20th century, both in terms of personal therapeutic and analytical treatment as well as in a variety of theories and frameworks of interpretation in specialized disciplines. From the study of religion to the analysis of poems, the interpretation of myths to the meaning of time, the presence of the Jungian influence has been pervasive. As well as direct Jungian-influenced schools of practice and thought, a number of other systems and approaches have also centered around the premise of a non-rational, hidden, but active and significantly purposive component of personality. In the works and influences for instance of Fromm, Horney, Rogers, Maslow, May, Allport, Frankl, Pearls amongst others, we find both practical and theoretical approaches dealing with this depth in man. Other orientations as well have emerged based upon theories of the unconscious. Some such as Herbert Marcuse, R.D. Laing and Norman O. Brown have extended the Freudian ground in more radical direction. And others like James Hillman have gone further within the Jungian framework. And despite even sometimes dramatic difference in perspective, the important common element is that the idea of the subconscious has become a component in the revision of many images of reality. To understand one of the important trends of envisioning the subconscious, we shall look briefly at some of the Jungian-inspired views on the nature of myth as a key to a deeper understanding of self. As mentioned in discussing the mythic cultural orientation, that modality of envisioning experience has become more internalized and further removed from the self-consciousness of modern man. Starting with another statement from Eliade, we are presented with an assessment of the status of things. Talking about the function of images, symbols, myths, he says this about the importance of understanding their role in subjective life. Consequently, the study of them enables us to reach a better understanding of man as he is, before he has come to terms with the conditions of history. This non-historical part of the human being wears, like a medal, the imprinted memory of a richer, a more complete and almost beatific existence. When a historically conditioned being, for instance, an Occidental of our own day, allows himself to be invaded by the non-historical part of himself, this is not necessarily a retrogression. Often he is re-entering by means of the images and symbols that come into play a paradisiac state of primordial humanity. He recovers the language and sometimes the experience of a lost paradise. Dreams, waking dreams, the images of his nostalgias and enthusiasms, etc., are so many forces that may project the historically conditioned human being into a spiritual world that is infinitely richer than the closed world of his historic moment. Focus on the depth of the psyche and the integration of the personality also subsumes a renewed appreciation and positive valuation of the imagination. Whether simply in terms of its functions as a mode of experience or as a source of creative images and energies, the positive and useful roles of the imagination has been a congruent theme in a number of inner-directed orientations. And the analyses of the nature and function of the imagination have come from many sources. Especially as a focus of particular philosophical inquiries, as subject matter of various psychological schools, as pertains to mythical and spiritual materials, in terms of the creative process in the aesthetic domain. One of the natural appeals of the imagination as a component for inner-directed ideational inclusion is that functionally it is a source of experience, knowledge, information other than that pertaining to the intellect and to the conceptual and rational means of cognition and categorization. And as a subjective mode of experience with its own capacities and forms of data, it was always a logical fit when incorporated into ideational systems valuing non-rational materials and methodologies. Inner-directed valuation of the imagination comes in many forms. One position is reflected in the Jungian and transpersonal psychological perspectives, which later filtered through in wider dissemination via the many variants of popular psychology. That basic view usually consists of a respectful acknowledgement of the efficacy of the imagination coupled with intentions of exploring, exercising, cultivating, expressing, integrating the substance of its manifestations. By trying to remember, record, find meaning in dream imagery, through creative artistic expression, through techniques and exercises designed to stimulate the processes and bring cognizance, and a number of other practices, the role of the imagination has been given significant legitimacy and value. Here is a typical general overview of the way the imagination was conceived in popular psychological thought in the latter part of the 20th century. Yet imagination is the forgotten and rusting key to many treasures of the mind. Imagination is the marvelous, uniquely human ability of mind to create and recreate life's experiences and life's thoughts and hopes and dreams in infinite variations, both pragmatic and chimeric. Imagination can recreate the past with the highest fidelity or transmute it to fit the whims of emotion. It can project its fabrications into any future it chooses. Images are used to solve problems or to gain relief from mind pressure by fantasy, or just to amuse oneself. As well as the different psychological interpretations of the nature and value of the imagination, other disciplines also made it a subject of inquiry. Particularly, it continued to be a topic of interest in philosophical speculation. Though the roots of the philosophical discussion of the imagination trace back to the beginning of philosophy itself, having been given explicit attention especially in Platonic and Neoplatonic speculation, in the idealist tradition, and extensively in 19th-century Romantic speculation, a diversity of treatments appeared throughout the 20th century. The intellectual ground had shifted by then, however, with the field of psychology, in all its forms, established as the more specialized authoritative discipline of inquiry. The philosophical approach to investigation of the imagination thus had to become more synthetic as well as more introspective. The greatest philosophical attention and analysis of imagination came from existential and phenomenological schools, followed next by the analytical school and by neo-romanticism. For all, the general approach was one of introspective reflection on the subjective phenomenon itself as experienced as well as integration of whatever supportive knowledge could be used. In some perspectives, the great majority of attention was directed to dissection of the imaginative process itself, using past philosophical treatments as the starting point. From there, with emphasis on the pure experience itself, it became possible to advance forward using the ideational materials of the specific conceptual framework of choice to construe more fine-tuned and particularly oriented theories and conclusions. Existential approaches dealt with concepts like possibility, nothingness, finitude, lack of natural given essence. The phenomenological perspective involved direct self-apprehension, bracketing, of normal and critical attitudes to the world, the intentionality of consciousness. The philosophy of mind with its analytic method focused most critically on the analysis of language and the objective of arriving at the most accurate and precise descriptions and classifications of mental processes. Neo-Romantic thought prioritized the uniqueness of the imagination, a fascination with the nature of the image, the twilight states of consciousness between waking and sleeping. The three main philosophical approaches are enunciated in these words from Eva T. H. Brand's The World of the Imagination. What the phenomenologists oppose is the notion of immanence. For the analysts, the objection is to the inwardness of the imagination process, the fact that it is hopelessly private. Neither school manages to give satisfactory positive accounts of the imagination, but both sharpen and subtleize the debate beyond anything else in the 2 millennia of the tradition. The neo-romantics, on the other hand, have no interest in clear conceptions, indeed they have an animus against them. By means of an eclectic romanticism, a new romanticism that is shot through with various theories of the 20th century, they raise the imagination and the image to an all-dominating status. We shall soon return to the neo-romantic perspective as it pertains to the aesthetic domain. However, as well as the traditional schools of thought and analysis, other more adventurous approaches to understanding the imagination appeared, and following in some even more speculative directions of neo-Jungian and independent philosophic thought, imagination is perceived to be a primary ontologically grounded reality-shaping cosmic process. Reality as we know it appears as it does, subjectively and objectively, because of intrinsic imaginal a priori categorical processing and delineation. Deriving from Plato's theory of eternal ideas, a certain speculative tendency extended beyond the confines of mainstream philosophic and psychological thought about imagination, though still grounded upon logical and conceptual criteria. For instance, the Imaginism philosophy of Edward Douglas Fawcett posits the imaginative function as the most analogous in terms of understanding the nature of reality. The activity of ultimate reality, the supreme power, resembles most closely the human experience which we call imagining. When God imagines, he creates. Nothing can exist outside of divine imagining. Reasoning is a useful creation of human imagining, but on the divine level it is inconceivable and would be a defect. It is in any case about reality. It can only attend to abstracted aspects and concepts. But the higher imagining is essentially concrete. There are some other philosophical theories which are semi-empathetic or very generally oriented in a similar direction on certain specific concepts. For instance, Whitehead's presentation of the theory of eternal ideas, and Santayana's picture of essences. However, Imaginism taken to its logical conclusion is more radical, perhaps a closer fit to some strains of archetypal psychology and para-Jungian speculation. The foundational place of imagination is reiterated by Robert Sabins in these words. We could also say that the function of imagination is to make palpable the fact that matter in its subjective, expressive aspect is spirit, and that spirit regarded objectively is the material world. In the end, the same spirit which on the periphery, i.e. unconsciously creates the world of objects, of actual mountains and trees, works in the artist to create the poem or the painting, only now in harmony with the peripheral, by no means secondary unconscious. We are simply saying that man started his career on earth not as an unconcerned onlooker facing a separate, unintelligible world about which he subsequently invented all manner of myth, but that he had to extricate his self-consciousness out of the world of his experience. He found himself through the intercourse with the not-self. We are considering here the phenomenon of imagination at its very birth, in the form of an intermediary realm between the conscious and the unconscious, inner and outer, which embodies the first images and constitutes the common matrix of myth and language. Also, from the standpoint of archetypal psychology, myth has its origin in a realm, in a reality, a state of affairs which is not altogether human, that is, the psychic realm. For the psyche, in a deepened version of the Jungian thought, is a wider, more encompassing notion than man. Particularly fruitful lines of thought were stimulated when considered from the microcosmic perspective of the individual as well as the macrocosmic all-encompassing overview. With the popularization of Corbin's use of the term imaginal, in reference to a self-subsistent order of reality, a mundus imaginalis, between the domains of sense and intellect, new evaluations of the imagination appeared in conjunction with the already existing materials of the specific analytical disciplines. Psychology, aesthetics, philosophy, hermeneutics and other fields where the imagination was a focal topic acquired further conceptual tools for speculative application. James Hillman here reflects upon the kind of re-envisioning of reality deriving from a renewed sense of the autonomous depths of imagination. With things returned again to soul, their psychic reality given with the anima mundi, then their interiority and depth psychology too, depend not on their experiencing themselves or on their self-motivation but upon self-witness of another sort. An object bears witness to itself in the image it offers, and its depth lies in the complexities of this image. Its intentionality is substantive, given with its psychic reality, claiming but not requiring our witness. Each particular event, including individual humans with our invisible thoughts, feelings, and intuitions, reveals a soul in its imaginative display. Our human subjectivity too appears in our display. Subjectivity here is freed from literalization in reflexive experience and its fictive subject, the ego. Instead, each object is a subject, and its self-reflection is its self-display, its radiance. Interiority, subjectivity, psychic depth, all out there. This type of a revision of focus allowed a more inner-directed evaluation of the nature of the imagination, placing it in an intermediary position within the larger ontological mix and legitimizing a renewed estimation of the reciprocal connections underlying all pertinent phenomena. And as well as extending the philosophical and psychological speculative horizons, discussion of the role of the imagination was a prominent issue in the domains of aesthetic inquiry and artistic reflection. As we have seen, the neo-romantic approach differed from the other mainstream philosophical methodologies by prioritizing the value of the images themselves and the modes of consciousness underlying the evocation and representation of those imaginative materials. Although a number of diverse schools and doctrines appeared throughout the 20th century, a significant strain of thought maintained some degree of empathetic continuity with the ideas and ideals of the Romantic movement. Gaston Bachelard perhaps is most representative of the neo-romantic approach to imagination, envisioning it as a distinctive mental faculty capable of opening up subjective experience to a unique dimension of values, represented by its imagery and communicable through aesthetic expression. He wrote, "The fundamental word corresponding to imagination is not image, but imaginary. The value of an image is measured by the extent of its imaginary radiance. Thanks to the imagination is essentially open, evasive. In the human psyche, it is the very experience of opening and newness. More than any other power, it determines the human psyche. For a complete psychology, imagination is, above all, a type of spiritual mobility. We must therefore systematically add to the study of a particular image the study of its mobility, its fertility, its life. Through dreams, reverie, contemplation, reading, aesthetic appreciation, the power of the image resonates and opens up the psyche to its intrinsic archetypal power. And the artist who is well attuned to the domain of the imaginary is capable through his work of providing an invitation to the voyage, allowing others to subjectively partake in the same sets of evocations and embedded feelings. For instance, Bachelard had this estimation of the role of the poet. Thus each poet owes us his invitation to the voyage. With this invitation we register, in our inner being, a gentle impulsion which shakes us, which sets in motion beneficent reverie, truly dynamic reverie. If as the initial image is well chosen, it is an impulsion to a well-defined dream, to an imaginary life that will have real laws of successive images, real vital meaning. But authentic mobility, the essence of which is to be found in imagined mobility, is not properly aroused by the description of reality, not even of reality in the process of becoming. The true voyage of the imagination is the voyage to the land, to the very domain of the imaginary. The poetic object, duly energized by a name rich in resonance, is a good conductor of the imagining psyche. The voyage into distant worlds of the imaginary truly conducts a dynamic psyche only if it takes the shape of a voyage into the land of the infinite. In the realm of the imagination, every immanence takes on a transcendence. This specific type of orientation provided a legitimizing framework for valuing the imagination, both in its creative and its contemplative aesthetic modes, as a conduit of access to a domain of value and meaning. Other inner-directed approaches were explicitly focused on the more radically transcendental spectrum of the Romantic interpretation of the imagination. Although the content of many contextual frames of reference had changed or evolved, positive esteem and value was directed to the imagination as the fertile ground of artistic creation and as a transcendentally grounded or at least spiritual or special subjective power. These kinds of assertions can be found expressed in a variety of 20th-century theories, reflections, critiques, schemes, doctrines, analyses. The following words, from 1970, express a prevalent adaptation of the Romantic approach towards the imagination, and give a representative view of how it was contemplated, evaluated, and incorporated into some inner-directed aesthetic thought. Going back to the thoughts of Blake, Coleridge, Keats, Shelley, Wordsworth, Emerson, and others for ideational support, and using that foundation to interpret and evaluate some contemporary alternative inner-directed tendencies of the times, this encompassing picture emerged. According to this epistemology and ontology, then, subject and object, mind and thing, man and nature are, in reality, inseparable, the two terminals of a single imaginative act. But in practice, due to the lethargy of custom, and, in consequence of the film of familiarity and selfish solitude, one of the terminals, man, has become insulated so that the spark, the flash that reveals reality, remains inert, in potentia. The poet is that man on whose mind and heart the egotistical film has not formed, or at least not hardened, so that now and again, in spots of time, in him the circuit is completed, and the currents of universal being flow through him. He is no longer an insular ego consciousness, but a cosmic consciousness. This is that glad day, when imagination, the real man, awakens in eternity's sunrise. That the psychedelic experience is very frequently imaginative in the sense of the word I have been outlining is the root of its kinship with literature, with the world of art. Their various contiguities stem from this source. This kind of interpretation of the imagination was not the only aesthetic perspective, but it did, in various shades and formulations, express an inner-directed orientation, prioritizing the non-rational and transcendental foundation believed to be operative. Considered as part of the overall context of inner-directed envisioning, the imagination generally was thought of as a significant human faculty, in some way a special indicator of a dimension of spirit, meaning, value. And as such, a component in the more inclusive perception and belief of a non-rational but significant and important depth as part of the human fabric.